Hello, welcome to the Addiction Hope online inaugural conference. And we are delighted today to present Steve Wright, and he will be talking to us about families and addiction and understanding the development of the addiction family system and supporting our loved ones in recovery. This is a CE event, so you can earn 1 hour of CEs as long as you attend the full event and complete the survey at the end. And a little bit about Steve. He is an LCPC RDDP, and he's a therapist at Timberline Knolls Residential Treatment Center. And he served for more than 25 years as a minister working in churches with the youth, families, and also as a senior pastor. As a counselor, he works in residential treatment as a therapist, supervisor, coordinator, and program director, first in the substance abuse field and then in the eating disorder field. And with that, I would like to introduce Wright.
Okay, thank you, and thank you all for joining us today. I want to talk to you today about family systems and about how the family systems of an addicted individual begins to get created. The work that I do here at Timberline Knolls, I do both individual work with women who struggle with a multitude of issues. Many times they struggle with substance abuse issues. Sometimes their addictive behavior is centered around an eating disorder, sometimes around self-injury behavior. But in any case, what we see is individuals who begin to exhibit pretty self-destructive behaviors. And when that begins to happen, family systems get created. Now, I want to just take a minute and talk a little bit about family systems just to begin with and as an introduction to this. Family systems get developed over time as members interact with one another in the system. Each member brings into these relationships their own history, their own genetic and epigenetic predispositions, cultural and societal frameworks. And the family system that gets created around an addiction is one that most often impacts every member of that system. When the behaviors of the addicted person begins to become organized around the substance use to the detriment of his or her life, or it may even be, as I said, an eating disorder or self-injury behavior or some other way of getting relational needs met that is unhealthy. When they begin to organize their behaviors around some of these things, then they become noticeable to family members, and family members then begin to react. Each family member tends to react to the addicted person differently, but also begin to react to each other as well. The addicted person's father, for instance, may become angry and aggressive more than the addicted person's toward the addicted person's behavior. And over time, these patterns begin to develop in which each person has adapted to the reality of the identified patient. As I said, the father may become angry and frustrated and deal with it in a more aggressive way. And then, and again, this is just an example. It's something that everybody kind of goes into this differently. But a mother who sees this happening might react to the father's aggression and try to cope with things and deal with things where she would have dealt with it differently with the addict. Now she's reacting to the father's aggression. And so these reactions begin to take place, and over time, these patterns begin to form. And we'll talk a little bit about that throughout the, when we get into the seminar a little bit. And through those patterns, a system eventually is developed in which each person has adapted to the reality of the identified patient or the addicted person. Now, once that system is formed, it acts like any other system. The status quo tends to be maintained, change becomes more difficult, and the members of the system become more defined in their roles. Now, today what I want to do is to take us through a family. Now, of course, this is a family that most people, I'm sure, are no longer with us. An old photograph that I picked up, but I want to use this as an opportunity to kind of describe how people begin to develop and react to substance abuse. To begin with, let's talk about what are the differences between substance use, substance abuse, and substance addiction. All right, so here we have Mary. Mary is a part of this family. She is one of the sisters. Mary drinks when she's out with friends. She enjoys socializing with people, but she only drinks 1 or 2 drinks on any occasion. She doesn't ever feel the need to drink more than that. She doesn't tend to give in to much peer pressure. She has no problem stopping and saying, no, I've had enough, I don't need anything else. So Mary, we would probably classify as a substance user. She drinks, but she doesn't drink abusively, and she doesn't have any issues with her drinking. Let's talk a little bit about Martha. This is Mary's sister. So Martha, she started smoking marijuana in high school. One of the things that Martha understood is that she enjoyed the way it made her forget her problems. She would smoke and feel high and not have to worry about the struggles she was having in school and the problems she was having at home. Eventually, it came about that Martha began to get bullied at school for some reason. And then what she discovered that is she used marijuana to avoid her hurt feelings. She could cope with life a little bit better. Now she uses marijuana alone whenever she feels distressed, but not typically otherwise. And it isn't really impacting much of her life. But she is using it. She's crossed that line to begin using in a way that is more abusive. And so we would call Martha a substance abuser. So now we go to Charlie. Charlie, for the purposes of this, is going to be our kind of identified patient, if you will, the individual who is addicted. Charlie started drinking in the military. Drinking for him became a way to escape the stress of combat. Now, Charlie, coming back home, still has some issues. He has PTSD issues, some nightmares, some difficulties facing his responsibilities and so forth. And so what he began to do is to use alcohol as a way to manage the distress and the stress that he was experiencing. So now he's back. He's back from active duty, and he is drinking on most days. And he's not just drinking a little bit, he's drinking to get drunk, and he continues to consume alcohol into intoxication. he began to understand that this was a problem for him. And so at one point he tried to stop when his family began to complain, but he wasn't able to sustain that. He began to drink a few days later. Now, when he stops drinking, he gets the shakes. And he has nightmares about using. And so what we would say is that Charlie kind of meets the criteria as being addicted to alcohol. So I think that's the one thing that we have to begin to understand. When we're talking about family systems, when we're talking about the families that we work with who are struggling, the thing we have to understand is that this is the issue with that addiction is that this has gone beyond casual use. It's gone beyond maybe even abusive use. It has reached a place where the substance has kind of taken control. And in a case like Charlie's, even though he sees some of the consequences, maybe he wants to stop drinking, he doesn't have the capacity to stop drinking. And he is really more being controlled by the alcohol than being controlled, than being in control of the alcohol. So this is our kind of our identified individual. Now what we want to do is then look at how does this impact the family. Let's go to Charlie's father. This is Henry. Henry began to observe some of the behaviors of his son. When Charlie became intoxicated, he very often wasn't a pleasant person to be around. And so Charlie sees these behaviors and Charlie becomes angry with, Henry becomes angry with Charlie when he shows up drunk to family events because it's so disruptive. He yells at Charlie. And one time, Henry got into a physical fight with his son because of the drinking. Inside Henry is ashamed and afraid for Charlie. And these are the thought processes that are going on. Henry cares for Charlie. He loves Charlie. If he didn't, he wouldn't be so frustrated and upset. Now, the thing that we have to remember about Henry is that he grew up with an alcoholic father himself. And so he has some baggage that he's carrying with him about Charlie's drinking. Henry decided he would never experience that in his life, and so abstained from alcohol for his life. But when he began to see Charlie, he began to experience a lot of frustration and anger, and some of his past began to show up. Henry kicked Charlie out of the house on 2 occasions. The one thing that we notice about Henry is that he feels like he is perpetually angry at all of this that's going on. Now, Henry, we would say, is a controller. He is trying to control Charlie because he's uncomfortable and because he loves Charlie and wants to fix the problem. Let's go to Sarah. Now, Sarah is Charlie's wife. Let's talk a little bit about how Sarah experiences some of this. So Sarah is deeply upset that Charlie drinks as much as he does. She is afraid of judgment. She fears judgment from society. She especially fears how this is going to impact the relationship at church. She's a religious person. And so there's a lot of fear underneath. Sarah, in order to appear, in order for her to appear okay and for others to see that everything's okay, will do things like call in to work for Charlie when he's too hungover to go, in order to kind of protect him and in order for her to feel good about herself. She tries to shield the rest of the family from Charlie's drinking. She will avoid family functions sometimes and try to keep things on the down low, so to speak. Now, Sarah is an enabler of Charlie. Also, as I've described her, there's some codependence involved in her experience with the relationship with Charlie, because she's begun to develop a sense of purpose in her life in protecting her family system from falling apart because of Charlie's drinking and keeping things intact. And she has begun to experience some sense of self-worth and self-value and identifying herself as the person who is keeping things all together, which impacts her sense of value. This is John. John is Charlie's brother. Now, John is very angry toward Charlie. He sees how his behavior is affecting the family. An incident happened, say, Christmas, where Charlie showed up drunk. John confronted him. And the argument that they had got very ugly, and John and Charlie have not spoken since that time. John is extremely resentful and avoids family functions now. John is very judgmental toward Charlie. He doesn't have an understanding that Charlie is at the point where he can't stop, even if he wants to, and that Charlie is experiencing a lot of guilt and shame because he knows how his behaviors are impacting the family. So let's talk about Ashley. Ashley is one of Charlie's daughters. He has two daughters. So Charlie and Sarah's youngest, she has a way of making everybody laugh. She doesn't do very well in school because she's often clowning around. She sometimes complains about stomach pain. And she is what we would call the mascot. And many of you maybe have studied some of these topics as far as the roles that children often play. Ashley would be the mascot in her role in trying to help the family system manage some of the difficulties that they're facing. Now we have Bethany, who is the oldest daughter. Bethany avoids being home as much as possible. She never invites friends over for fear that her dad is going to be drunk and embarrass her. Bethany is on the honor roll. She's on the lacrosse team. She has the lead in the school play every year and sings in the church choir. A little bit of an overachiever. She tries to protect her younger sister when her dad yells when he's drunk. So she tries to step in. Bethany would be designated as the hero. And her role as the hero is to help the family system appear more normal by her behavior. If she can behave well enough, then people won't see the family system as broken. And maybe dad will want to stop drinking because she's being so good. These are some of the thoughts I think that go on in Bethany's mind. This is Elizabeth. Elizabeth is Charlie's mother. Charlie's mother tends to protect Charlie from Henry by stepping in when arguments begin to happen. She tends to minimize the behaviors that she sees in Charlie. She pretends that nothing is wrong and cries when conflict occurs. On 2 occasions, she secretly purchased alcohol for Charlie when he was suffering from withdrawal. Elizabeth is an enabler of Charlie. One of the things that I know I've seen in families that I've worked with is, especially with mothers, this can happen, where a mom is so fixated on their child not experiencing suffering that they do things to help them from not experience suffering to the detriment of the person. So that all the way from childhood, very often this takes place, and the mother sometimes will, and fathers too, sometimes will protect the child from adverse consequences to the point that the individual, the child, doesn't have the capacity to tolerate any distress whatsoever. So Elizabeth is one of those types of parents where she's an enabler, and it's just intolerable for her to see her child suffer in any way. The last person we want to talk about is Beatrice. Now, Beatrice has always looked up to Charlie when she was growing up. This is Charlie's other sister. She is devastated by watching Charlie self-destruct, and it's internally agonizing for her. The things that's begun to happen in Beatrice is that she started showing signs of anxiety, signs of depression, and no one in the family are aware that she is suffering. She does so in a very quiet manner. When conflict happens, she isolates in another room and just kind of distracts herself with other things, even though it is very, very distressing for her. Beatrice is one we would consider as a lost person in this family system. So that describes the family of Charlie and kind of the struggles that they're facing. Now, I want to put a graph up here to kind of describe a little bit of this further. And just a simple way of beginning to understand the processes that go on, just as I've described in the family system for Charlie's family. The addict begins to exhibit behaviors. That is when the system begins to change, when there are noticeable changes in the behaviors of the person that is using. Those behaviors elicit family reactions. Now, as we said earlier, and you were looking at this family system, you noticed how each of the individuals reacted. You had Charlie, who wants to quit, struggles with drinking, is using alcohol as a means to manage his PTSD symptoms. You see Dad reacting angrily. He's carrying his own baggage with him into this situation. You see Mom impacted by this and is reacting not just to Charlie, but to Henry, Charlie's father. You have the belligerent and judgmental and angry brother. You have the children that are impacted, and they're kind of managing their way. And so everybody is reacting in different ways. Now, eventually those reactions turn into patterns of how people react. Henry doesn't get angry just once. Henry gets angry all the time. And eventually, as you read, gets to the place where he feels like he is perpetually angry. Now, these family patterns will eventually turn into a family system. The family system is the adaptation of these family patterns, the adaptation of each of the members to the addict and his behaviors. As everyone kind of develops this process, this circle of reacting, creating patterns, eventually everyone adapts to the reality that Charlie drinks, he drinks too much, he gets intoxicated, he's addicted to this substance, and he is not going to stop anytime soon. So all of us have adapted to the reality of what this is. And that's what we call a family system. And a family system created around an addiction. Now, the thing that's interesting for us to understand is that everyone has a role to play in this situation. And in order for recovery to happen, recovery isn't just for the addict, just for the person that is addicted. Recovery has to happen for the entire system, every person involved. So I want to talk a little bit about what that looks like. So let's begin with the road to recovery. And for this, we want to look at the changes that begin to happen and can happen. And what are some of the pitfalls that a family system experiences? First thing let's say Charlie decides that I am so tired of this, I can't do this on my own, I need help. And he goes in for treatment. And Charlie's situation was so profound that he decided he needed residential treatment. He went into a program that dealt with not just his substance abuse, but his struggles with post-traumatic stress, so that he could deal with both of those things at the same time. Now, Charlie, while he was in treatment, he began to learn about how alcohol and addictions happen. He gained education about the impact of alcohol on his brain, about the genetic component that's involved, and about how he had reached a point where he actually realized he did not have control and was able to let go of some of the guilt and shame about that and begin to focus not on the regret of letting go of his alcoholism, but on the desire to never allow his alcoholism to impact his family in the way that it did. He begins to understand how he used alcohol to avoid the distress of his traumatic memories. And again, in the treatment that he went to, he experienced new skills in addressing the PTSD issues without having to resort to alcohol in order to cope. He develops new ways to cope. He develops distress tolerance tools. He develops a way to manage when he has urges to drink, because they began to come up. Probably 3 weeks into his treatment, he began to have dreams that he was using. He smelled something while he was in treatment, and it triggered an intense urge to go out and get a drink, and he had a craving and an urge to drink. And he began to understand not just some of the withdrawal symptoms, but the post-acute withdrawal symptoms that began to occur. So he began to develop and grow and gain insight into himself. At one point during treatment, Charlie went to war against his addiction. He realized his life was unmanageable. He started going to meetings. He got a sponsor. He started going to church. And at some point, Charlie went home. So now we enter into a very difficult thing. Charlie has had, I don't know, maybe a month of treatment. and he has worked through a lot of his issues, and he's made some strides, and he is determined to really kick this thing. He has a sponsor. He has he's signed up for meetings. He's decided, I'm going to go 90 and 90. I'm going to go to 90 self-help meetings in 90 days, and he's really determined to kind of deal with this. The issue for Charlie is that he's going to come back into this family system. Each of these individuals have not had the opportunity to make any changes or understanding of how they relate to Charlie. In early recovery, and this is something I think is a very important thing to share, and I share this with our families when I'm talking to the family system, the families that I'm working with. And it's an understanding of the progress in recovery. So at the beginning of someone seeking help, they typically are very aware of their addiction. And because the family system has been in place and is understanding, the family is very aware of the addiction. And when we go back to this family system and we look at these individuals, everybody knows, although many times they're not talking about it, that Charlie drinks and is intoxicated often, and everyone has adjusted to that. And so everyone is aware of the addiction, the person who's addicted and the family members. But now Charlie enters into treatment. He begins to want to make a change. He begins to look to overcoming some of the struggles and some of the things that he's been facing. While he's in treatment, he begins to gain insight into himself. He begins to understand that he was impacted by things that happened to him when he was a kid. He begins to understand that there was absolutely some genetic predisposition toward addiction, in that he has a grandfather that was an alcoholic. And he begins to gain insight into the development of the disease for him, in recognizing that he is trying to cope with some pretty traumatic experiences that he experienced in the military when he was in active duty. And those insights begin to really kind of gain traction for him. Then he begins to learn skills. He begins to develop an awareness that that he can organize his behaviors, not around his thoughts and feelings, but around his values and his commitments. He realized that those skills can help him even when he begins to experience triggers. And he begins to practice those skills. He begins to implement those things into his life. Then his motivation increases. He begins to see that, wow, what I did impacted the people around me in a pretty negative way. I don't ever want that to happen again. I don't want to impact the people in my life in a negative way. And you can see the development over time as Charlie goes through treatment into his early recovery phase. But I want you to notice the bottom half of this graph. The only thing that the family experienced is an awareness of the addiction. Now, many of them are very happy and very glad that Charlie went to treatment and that he is in treatment, and that he is getting fixed, so to speak. But the issue is that when Charlie ends treatment, he is much farther along on this recovery timeline than the family is. And I guess the question that I often ask is, how is a family going to treat a person when they come home? Well, they're very likely going to treat that person where they are, not where the person is. So the behaviors, and that's why we do family therapy, because we understand this principle here. And the issue is that the family system has not had the opportunity to see the difference in the person. And so the family members are full of distrust, are still very angry very often, are still struggling with some of these issues that have been ongoing, are really stuck in the roles and don't know how to be different than they are. And very often that makes it very, very difficult for the person coming home. If the person coming home perceives that they are in a very good place and managing very well, and they go home into an environment where they're mistrusted and the people are kind of functioning in their lives, are functioning out of their fears, very often they become discouraged and feel invalidated. And that invalidation very often tends to push them back toward relapse. A person will get to that place where everyone is still treating him or her like the addict, and eventually will say, well, fine, if that's the way you see me, I'm going to go back to doing what I was doing. I can't cope with the invalidation. And so it does make it more difficult for the person. One of the things that we can do for the people that are in recovery, that are working toward this, is first of all, to help them understand that their family isn't going to treat them the way that they expect to be treated, because they are not inside their head. They don't have the understanding of what's been happening internally in recovery for this person. And so the key is to help the recovering person recognize, first and foremost, that recovery cannot depend on how family treats you, and that you have to come to a sense of acceptance that family members are where they are, and allow them the time through observing your recovery motivated behaviors to catch up with you without getting too frustrated or upset that they're not there yet. And so if a person can do that and take control, take charge of that sense of recovery, and allow for their family members to catch up to them, that's when I think the system has the most likelihood of complete recovery. So what are some of the unique challenges to the family system? First of all, I think, is overcoming mistrust. As I said in the chart that you just saw, mistrust is a big thing. For most people who struggle with addictions, in order to maintain that addiction, they have had to do things to allow them, allow themselves to keep that. Sometimes lying, sometimes spending money that they don't have, sometimes being very deceitful, very manipulative. And over time, the people in their life begin to mistrust them and see them as a person who really can't be trusted. And so what does that mean? I think one of the conversations I have most often with family members when we're in family therapy and we're getting ready for discharge is that the individual I'm working with is really quite far along in their sense of recovery. But what happens is that the family members in that session very often will begin to come up with their what if scenarios. Well, what if this, and what if that, and what if this person calls? What am I supposed to do? And a lot of times it has this air of I'm responsible to make sure that this works, instead of understanding that for the client, for the person, they're the ones that has to be in charge of making this work. So there's a lot of difficulty in overcoming this trust. Letting go of control is another issue that I often see. When a person is tied to their addictive behaviors, it is what they use to kind of cope with life in most situations that I come across. The people around that individual who see this stuff going on struggle with it to the point that they know that it's hurting the person that they love, and they want them to let go of it. And so they begin to exercise control in trying to make them let go. And that sense of control is met with a lot of resistance, because for the individual who's still caught up with these behaviors, what they're struggling with is they don't have any other skills to manage the distress that they're experiencing except this pretty self-destructive way. When a person goes into treatment, then they are trying to let go of this themselves. They don't want it anymore. They're the ones that are in charge of letting go of it. But the family members only know how to relate to the individual whereas they're tied to these behaviors. And so they don't know how to let the person be the general, so to speak, in his or her war against their own addiction. And they don't know how to be the lieutenant in the war themselves. Or how, in other words, how do we let the person who is wanting to recover take charge and take control of his recovery, and how can this family system begin to adapt to that and offer support in the setting. So letting go of control is a very unique, difficult challenge for a family system when there's addiction involved. The family is often coping with a lot of fears: fear of relapse, fear of things going back to the way they were, fear of having to be the person that they were, because many of the individuals in the system don't necessarily like who they are or how they react. So they cope with a lot of fear of relapse. And the unique challenge is learning how to support. One of the things I think I noticed a lot when I'm working with family members about this issue of learning how to support is that the family members have an idea of what good support looks like, but they don't often take into account the thoughts and feelings of the person who is struggling with the addiction and is actually needing the support. And so they often do things that they believe are supportive, but for the person who's struggling, it's the opposite of support. It's invalidating, it's disturbing, it's distressing, and often causes more problems. So one of the things that we have to do is to figure out, how do we communicate effectively? How do we allow the person in the family system to be in charge of making the statements? What worked in the past? What didn't work in the past? This is what you can do to help me when this happens. And so there's an amount of honesty that has to be created, and a communication of honestly how people are feeling in that system. And so learning how to support can be a very difficult thing. So now I want to talk a little bit about what are some of the tips for families. And the first thing for me, as I'm discussing in a family session with someone who's struggling is about communication. The system, the people in that system need to learn how to communicate differently. The first thing is that they learn to be honest with, they have to learn to be honest with one another. With addictions, the secret keeping that is inherent in the addiction is a very big thing to overcome. The person who is working to break free of an addiction has to break that habit of dishonesty. And what we see in treatment is that very often they're very willing to begin to do that. They're tired, they're worn out, and they just don't want to keep up the pretense anymore. But the one thing that is also something I notice is that family members very often have a difficult time being honest themselves with how they were feeling when the person was struggling, and with describing how they're feeling to each other. The first session that I ever have with a family when I'm doing family therapy is to ask the question for each of the people in the room, when this person was struggling the most, how did you experience it? What feelings were coming up for you? What was it like to watch this person experience the struggles that they were experiencing? And probably, I would say 80% of the time, when the family members begin to describe how they felt and what they thought, it's new information for the person who was struggling. Because the family members very often keep those feelings and those thoughts to themselves. Well, if we can break open that, that scenario and allow everyone in the room to begin to be honest, everyone in the family to begin to be honest, it really does facilitate a much better chance of recovery, in my estimation. So honesty is a big piece. Family members need to learn to be open with one another. No more closed doors. I don't know if any of you have looked at the Joe Harry window, but the idea that the more I open up with other people, the more help I will get. And if we open up with one another, we gain a better understanding of what we're thinking, what we're feeling. And especially in the family where there is a need to recover, the idea of being able to be open and honest with one another can be very, very helpful. The last thing is to be willing to change. That's the big thing. We go back to the picture of our family and we look at Henry, the father. It might be difficult for Henry to change because he is carrying with him a lot of pain from his childhood in the fact that his dad was an alcoholic and was abusive toward him. And so seeing this might be something that's challenging. Henry might need to go address some of his own struggles and issues as they begin to come up. But if there is a willingness for the family system to change, for each individual in the system to change, the outcomes tend to be better. Letting go of the urge to control. And I wanted to talk just a little bit about this because that is a strong one. The individual needs to remember that they are not their addiction. But the family members also need to remember that this person is not their addiction, that this loved one that they have is not their addiction. And the thing to recognize, and when we're letting go of this urge to control, what we want to do is to make it better for the other person. But the thing we have to realize is that if this person doesn't choose to recover, then they don't recover. We can't make them recover. No one can make anyone do anything. They can choose to recover, or they may not choose to recover. But we have to begin to kind of come to grips with that question and help our families, the families we work with, understand that. The individual that's struggling has to choose to recover, or they just won't recover. And this is a statement I think that I've observed often, is that a controlling family system is often a source of relapse, often leads to relapse in that other person's life. Because there is such a profound sense of invalidation, in weakness, and a sense that I am not strong enough to make these decisions on my own. And so very often, if a family system is very, very controlling, it's usually more likely, in my estimation, that person will fall back into relapse. So there are some very simple ways on how to be supportive in a family system with someone who is recovering from an addiction. The first thing is to validate and not fix. I don't know how many times I had this conversation with parents, especially, where an individual is struggling with something, and they tell their parent, and they're being taught, you need to be honest with what you feel, and they will tell their parent, Mom, Dad, I am very afraid and I'm really anxious. And the first thing that comes out of Mom or Dad's mouth is, well, did you try to do this? Or did you try to do that? Or you shouldn't be anxious. You don't have anything to be anxious about. And a lot of it is about trying to fix the feeling that the individual is having. It is much better to simply validate and to not feel like you have the responsibility to fix anybody. And validation would look like, wow, I can see that, I hear that you're telling me that you're anxious, and I hear that you're telling me that you're struggling with some fears. That must be really hard. I just want you to know I'm here. Is there anything that you need me to do to kind of help you right now? And maybe the individual has something or doesn't have something. But if we can validate what that experience is without trying to fix it, I think we are able to be much more supportive. Ask, don't tell is another kind of principle on being supportive. In the scenario that I just shared, where a person expresses, I'm having a lot of anxiety and I'm having perhaps the urge to go out and get a drink. Very often the statements start coming forth. Did you call your sponsor? Are you doing your distress tolerance? Here, let me get this to help you. Instead of telling the person, simply ask the person, okay, I hear that you're struggling. Is there anything I can do? What do I need to do to help you? Can I support you in any way? And give that person a sense of empowerment in being able to say yes or no. And then avoid giving advice. Advice giving often comes across as, you don't know what you need, I know what you need, this is what you should do. And advice giving is about saying you should do this and you should do that. And, I see family members shooting on their loved one all the time. And so advice giving often is not as helpful as simply being there and validating and asking, what can I do to help you? So here, Charlie is going home. Family is in family therapy. The one thing that I want to maybe talk about as well with this is, what about the situation? When do you know that it might be time to help that person get back into treatment if there is a relapse? And I think that is, if the conversations have begun to be more open and honest, then very often it makes it a little bit easier. But it may not. I mean, that individual may continue to struggle with that addiction, may continue to try to cope with life by using. And so then we have to come to that place where we intervene in some way, shape, or form. I think the key in order to do that is to be able to set really good boundaries, to stop enabling the individual, and to offer treatment for that person, having set and maintained some really good boundaries. And getting that person back into treatment, I think, is a very, very good way of kind of dealing with this and managing it. So here is the family, Charlie's family. My hope is that each of them will address some of the individual needs that they have, and that they will become very, very supportive of Charlie in his process of recovering from his addiction to alcohol. All right.
Excellent presentation, Steve. Thank you very much. It was really fascinating to go through the characters of the family. We just have a couple of quick questions, and one was, do you have any inspirational story of a family that has really turned it around that you could share to inspire the clinicians watching?
Oh, well, I actually have a number of them. Let me talk about an individual that I spoke with on the phone yesterday. This is a woman who was in our treatment facility. She was here for quite a while. She struggled with PTSD from some sexual trauma that occurred when she was a child. The result was that she experienced a lot of difficulty and multiple issues, a little bit of substance abuse, self-injury behavior, eating disorder. All of these things were things that she did in order to cope with the pain and struggle and suffering. She had a difficult family situation with her husband, who was kind of emotionally disconnected and reacting in a way where, instead of being belligerent and angry and frustrated, he simply withdrew. She was with us for a number of months, and we were able to kind of help her work through some of her PTSD issues and grounding herself and managing well. But then she also began to, we had a lot of good therapy sessions with her and her husband. And as a result, she, again, she called me up yesterday. She had some ups and downs. She went through PHP, she went through intensive outpatient, she went back to PHP. But as of yesterday, her and her husband are in a much better place. She is caring for her 3 children and enjoying it. And her symptoms have decreased. And she has been self-injury free and eating disorder free and substance free for probably 6 or 8 months at this point. So a lot of good things have kind of come about for her. And just it was an inspiring story, because she went through a very, very difficult time and had multiple issues that she was trying to face.
Wow, I'm impressed with her. That's a lot of strength to turn that around. That's so encouraging. Another question we had from the audience was, what if the addict also has another issue like sex addiction?
In any addiction, we're working with the resident, to the individual, to try to cope with the things that they're using as avoidant behaviors. Okay? Substance abuse is an avoidant behavior. sex addiction is an avoidant behavior. People use these behaviors as ways to cope with the distress that they're feeling, to feel good about themselves. And they're organizing their behaviors around their thoughts and their feelings. And so they lose the ability to kind of organize their behaviors around their commitments and values. And so the same types of things are the things that we would do for both the addict who is struggling with addiction, with substances, or the addict who's dealing with sexual behavior. And so helping them kind of cope with those in developing skills other than the pretty detrimental skills that they're using to cope with how they're feeling.
Yeah, absolutely. I so identified, you know, my personal struggle was an eating disorder, but any addiction or process addiction, I can identify on so many levels, Steve. It's just that, and your comment about avoidant behavior and trying to cope and comfort ourselves is just what we all are looking for, something to heal that. And that's why we're so grateful for you and many of the clinicians in our audience that help empower us to figure out how to live life straight up.
Yeah.
Well, oh, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I think that, you know, if I were to encapsulate what the goal is, it's figuring out how to suffer well. You know, how to have distress, how to suffer, how to experience hardship, and do it well without having to avoid it.
Yeah. Oh, we must have you back. And there are some additional questions that we won't have time to address, but I will forward those to Steve and ask him to respond. So
absolutely.
Be assured your question will be addressed. And just to wrap things up, remember to fill out the survey. I put it in the chat box down to your right. That it's brief, but that'll help you obtain your CE. And check out the handouts. Also, there's a copy of the presentation that Steve generously provided, and also more about him. And with that, I just want to really thank you, Steve, and thank Timberline Knolls for sharing all your insight and experience with us. We are really better off for having listened to this presentation.
Jacqueline, it's been my pleasure, and I hope that it has helped, so appreciate it.
All right, have a great day. Thank you for attending. Bye-bye.
Bye.